My name is Chris Judge. I'm with the University of South Carolina Lancaster's Native American Studies Center, and today I'm talking about the pre-contact periods of Native American history prior to European contact. I remember a long time ago driving into Camden, and on the highway there was a sign and it said, South Carolina's oldest inland city, founded in 1732. And that's wrong. There was a large town here 500 or 600 years earlier than that. We know it from history as Kofetacheki, a very large chiefdom level, almost state level society that was here for hundreds of years prior to the European founding of Camden. Now we know that for 13,000 years, Native Americans have been living in what we now call the Watery Valley. And we know that from archaeological excavations, and we know that from things that just folks in the public have found. So there's a long history, pre-contact here in the area. I've been working on the final chapter of this prehistory, this period that archaeologists have come to call the Mississippian period. And the Mississippian period is denoted by large villages. Those villages usually have a large earthen mound or several earthen mounds as part of these complexes. They are often surrounded by large palisaded walls, posts in the ground, maybe between 5 and 8 acres enclosing with these mounds on the inside of them. There would have been houses inside and outside of the palisade wall. They were farmers. They would have grown corn and beans and squash and many other agricultural products. They also relied on hunting and fishing and gathering in the nearby woods. This is the zenith, if you will, of cultural complexity prior to Europeans coming in and settling. We get an eyewitness to this, the end of this culture, if you will, by 3 Spanish explorers. Hernando de Soto comes through here in May of 1540, 600 men marching from Florida on their way to Mexico, came to Camden, South Carolina, when they heard that there was gold and silver here. So they come in 1540. In 1566 and again in 1568, Juan Pardo, another Spaniard, comes out of Beaufort County where there's a site called Santa Elena, Spanish capital of Florida, from 1566 to about 1576, and a town abandoned in 1587. And then Pedro Torres comes up here with about 60 people from St. Augustine to investigate Europeans on horseback. Thought perhaps to be folks coming out of Jamestown and contacting Kofetacheki. So we have these accounts of what's going on. And then Henry Woodward is the last European to see Kofetacheki. Comes in 1670, right about the time Charleston is founded, visits with what he calls the emperor. There's about 1,000 bowmen here. So this is still a very large town in 1670 at the time of the founding of Charleston. In 1806, a guy named William Blanding moved to Camden. He was a physician, antiquarian, if you will, someone who was very interested in Native Americans and what they'd left behind. And when he came to Camden, he found out pretty quickly that there was a whole series of these mounded village sites up and down the Watery River, and became very interested in those. And in fact, drew a map of these sites in the Camden area. And this was published in 1848 in the very first publication of the Smithsonian Institution. And so these sites in this area have long been part of American archaeology and have been studied since that time. In the 1890s, the Smithsonian came down and excavated at some of the sites in the Camden area. And so we get our first sort of scientific look at what those sites were. And then in the 1950s, the University of Georgia and the Charleston Museum excavated at sites in the Watery Valley. And then since the 1970s, sporadically on and off, the University of South Carolina's anthropology department has been working on the sites in the Watery Valley. What we have learned is that these are sort of smaller versions of a place called Cahokia. And Cahokia is near East St. Louis on the Mississippi River. And about 1000 AD, a new lifestyle began there. And that lifestyle is based on maize agriculture, a new religion that is based on the sun, and the kind of astrological observances, and what we think is that based on later historic contacts with Native Americans, that they worship the sun. The chiefs were the son of the sun on earth. And the chiefs would often come out of their houses and point the way for the sun to travel across from morning to evening and set. And so they purported to have special powers that won the sun, but also the power for rainfall. And if you think about it, in an agricultural society, the two most important things you need are solar radiation, the sun, and moisture, rainfall, to make that happen. Across South Carolina, around 1400, we see a series of droughts. And these droughts would have, one, been very detrimental to agriculture, and two, would have undermined the power of the chiefs. So by the time the Europeans are arriving, we think these societies may be already in collapse. A recent book called Mega Drought in the Carolinas is documenting this decades of drought, first identified in the Savannah River and now identified in the Wateree Valley. So that long we've thought that Europeans coming in introduced diseases, slavery, and other forms of genocide and deplete these cultures, but they may have already been in some level of decline and then pushed to the edge by European contact. Let me talk about the artifacts that are found that are associated with the Mississippian period. The single largest category of artifacts that we find is pottery. Fashioned in clay, coiled like a snake and fired. And a lot of different designs occur on those pots. We call them complicated stamp designs, and they're indicative of this period. There's also very small triangular arrow points. A lot of folks call those bird points, but that is the point that would have been used for hunting, for warfare, just every day. There's no large points, and they seem to decline in size over time as the bow technology increases. They get better at bows and bow strings and the power in the bow, and so they don't need a very large point. They end up with a very small point that just needs to be pierced. Stone axes, we call them celts, polished stone, green stone used for these and used for everything from chopping down trees for firewood to digging trenches in the clay soils along the river to building these palisade walls and things like that. We have found bone fish hooks, so we know that they're fishing for fish like striped bass and sturgeon, large fish in the rivers. In some places, they've even built weirs, cone-shaped arrangements of rocks in the river where they would have strung nets and baskets and trapped fish in great numbers. We know that they're building canoes. The Spanish at Cofetachequi say that there's just all kinds of canoes for travel up and down the river. The DeSoto expedition documents very large ones that dozens of people could travel in. So they're tethered to the river for transportation, as well as walking on trails that would have been like Highway 521 going by Camden here. Starting about 3,000 years ago, we enter a period that archaeologists have termed the Woodland Period. It's defined in a very large regional to be the eastern woodlands, so the area east of the Mississippi River Valley. During the Woodland Period, people who had previously been highly mobile, lightweight toolkit, moving and not really staying in any kind of permanent residence, began to settle down a little bit. And so we start to see houses, substantial houses, for the first time. And they are beginning to add to their long subsistence strategy of hunting and gathering, gardening. Unlike the subsequent Mississippian period, the woodland folks are growing native crops, things like chenopodium, goosefoot, all things that you've heard before, I'm sure, and sunflower and starchy and oily seeds, very small, things that are really not economically viable today, but they're starting to do that gardening. We see the introduction of the bow and arrow for the first time. Many things that people call arrowheads are actually spear points. We start to see the bow and arrow for the first time. And as you garden, you can attract animals to your garden just by doing it. Just by gardening, they're going to come. If you've ever had a garden, the deer will come and eat it, of course, in South Carolina. And the bow and arrow is a way of hunting from your garden, the critters that come in and start taking their food that you haven't given permission to. It also allows you, when you stay in one place, you have to go further afield to hunt, and the bow allows you to hunt from a greater distance. So it's an innovation that probably starts in Asia, spreads to the rest of the world, and is introduced in South Carolina during the Woodland Period. We start to see for the first time mound building in South Carolina in the Woodland Period. And what we see are small conical mounds that are burial mounds, true burial mounds, where usually an adult male is buried underground, a mound is put over them, another layer is put over that, and then other people are added to that. There's a few of those in South Carolina. They're more common in other places. Later, when we get to the Mississippian period, those mounds are flat top. They are used for substructures for the homes of chiefs. Now, sometimes they are built on cemeteries. They are platforms on which structures are built. And we see from the historic record residence for the chief, temples, and sometimes places where boxes of bones of deceased elders and important people are kept. So for instance, when DeSoto gets to Camden, he goes to a place called Talamico. In the Muskogean language, Tale is town and Miko is chief, so chief's town. This is an abandoned village at the time of DeSoto, and it is the ancestral home of the Lady of Cofetacheki, who is the leader of this very large chieftain-level society that meets Hernando DeSoto and his 600 men. They're housed in half the houses in the village to give you an idea of the size of this. Talamico has a temple on top of it, and the descriptions say it is guarded by 6 wooden statues, full-size warriors with their bows drawn. Inside are rooms full of copper artifacts. There's rooms full of marine shell artifacts and bones of boxes of the deceased individuals from that society, and also a lot of freshwater pearls. Now, DeSoto in Florida had been told if he went to Cofetacheki, he would get gold and silver. When he arrives, what he finds is the gold is copper and the silver is mica. And this is very disappointing because he has been told by the King of Spain to find an overland route to Mexico, find the great river in the interior that goes to the silver mines at Zacatecas, and bring Christianity to the Indians. And he has left Tallahassee, Florida, and walked to Camden because he's told gold and silver is there and it's a 2-day march to the Atlantic Ocean. And he figures, why go to Mexico when I can bring gold and silver to the boats, the ships, and sail straight back to Spain? So very disappointing. The earliest South Carolinians would have been here during the last ice age. We call them Paleo-Indians. We have really good evidence of folks here by 13,000 years ago. We have some limited, tantalizing, but very interesting evidence of what we call the pre-Clovis, who were here around 15,000, 16,000 years ago, but only on one site on the Savannah River. These folks were highly mobile, hunted large animals that are extinct at the end of the Ice Age, made very beautiful lancelet spear points, did not stay in one place. They chose the best glass-like rocks they could find for their tools. And we see a preference for where major creeks hit major rivers to be the places where they live. So it's kind of like the interstate highways that have the exit ramps. There's motels, fast food restaurants, and pharmacies where you can get all the kind of materials that you need. And so that's the Paleo-Indian period. So about 13,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. It ends at the end of the last ice age. Following the Paleo-Indian period is the early Archaic period, from about 10,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago. It's the initial adaptation to a changing climate, vegetative regime, and different animals, with about 30 species of large animals becoming extinct. The response we see is to broaden the items that are being used for food from big game to many things. And we see a change in weaponry. We see the introduction of the atlatl, spear throwing device. Paleo-Indians would walk up to a large animal and thrust a spear into it. A white-tailed deer is hard to capture that way, so they invent a tool that allows them to do that. We see a change in the spear point technology. The large lancelet Clovis points go away, and they are followed with notched points like you see in the exhibit right there. The Middle Archaic follows the early Archaic and goes from about 8,000 to 5,000 years ago. We see a decrease in the range that people are moving around in. We think that there's a population explosion. There's an event called the hypsothermal worldwide warming trend, which would have increased vegetation, would have allowed animals that eat vegetation like white-tailed deer to explode, and thus the human populations explode. We see a change in spear points. We see the notch points go away and stem points replace those. We see a large emphasis on mast foods like hickory, acorn, and black walnut. And this is about a 3,000 year period. And we don't know as much about this period as many of the other periods. Final stage of the Archaic, we call the Late Archaic. The Late Archaic is a period of great innovation and change. We see a container revolution. We see people starting to make stone containers and clay containers. And what they're doing is they are starting to cook starchy foods, seed foods that require simmering, like a rice would require 45 minutes of simmering in a pot to cook. And so container revolution is related to that. We also see a change in socio-political complexity. People are starting along our coast to build these large shell ring features. We don't see those inland, but we do see occupations of the Late Archaic, largely from their pottery. And the pottery of the Late Archaic is very distinctive. They take clay and water and Spanish moss, mix it together, and make the very first pottery that we see of any Native Americans in the United States.
Welcome to historic Camden. This is the Kershaw County, Kershaw Cornwallis House. It was originally built on this site in 1777. We're standing on a reconstruction of the house that once was here. And it's a beautiful house for today's standards, but back in the Revolution, this was a mansion. So this was built by Joseph Kershaw, a founding father of Kershaw County. This is a picture of Joseph Kershaw. He was the founding father of Kershaw County, and he was the father of Camden. So we're going to talk about this gracious home that he built on this very same site. He was a merchant who originally came from Yorkshire, England, to Charleston, South Carolina. And when he got to Charleston, he got up with some merchants who wanted to open an inland merchant deal store up in Camden. So this is about as far up the Wateree River as you could go before you hit the rocks in the falls. So they decided to settle right in this area, because the Camden was founded in 1730. So that's when the river traffic came this direction. 1730, Camden was founded. In 1750, Quakers came down from Virginia and the Pennsylvania area. Irish Quakers, Scotch-Irish, came to Camden. Joseph Kershaw actually arrived here in 1758, and he set up his mercantile business with John Chestnut. He was very successful, and he became very wealthy. In 10 years, in 1768, he changed the name. Originally it was called Pine Tree Hill. Before that it was called Fredericksburg. But in 1768, Joseph Kershaw founded the name of Camden after Lord Camden. He was Charles Pratt from England. He was in the Parliament. 1766-65, he was a champion of the Parliament, and so that's why the Camden was named after him, and the colonial rights were satisfied for the people of Camden. Joseph Kershaw was very successful at that point. Middle of the town was right in front of us, and he had about 80 buildings right in front of him on this side of the road. On the other side of the highway was all the businesses, and he became very wealthy with all his businesses. He had a flour mills, he had a store mills, he had a brewery and a distillery and several other businesses. And between 1758, when he came here, and the Revolution, he was very wealthy. So he decided he'd build this beautiful house here, And he started his construction of the house in 1777, and it took about 2 years to build it right prior to the American Revolution. Little did he know that the American Revolution was right upon him. And so in 1780, when the war started in Charleston, South Carolina, Charleston fell to the British, and the most important town was Camden. And so the British came up to Camden immediately, overtook the town. Lord Cornwallis saw this beautiful house, and he decided that this was going to be his headquarters. So poor Joseph Kershaw and his family were taken prisoner. Joseph Kershaw and his brother Eli were taken as prisoners of war, and they were sent to Bermuda. His wife and kids were banished to the 3rd floor during when Cornwallis was here. So that tells about the house itself. This is the interior of the Kershaw Cornwallis house. Originally it was a beautiful house. We don't know exactly the interior of it because we know what the house looked like from the outside, but not the inside. This is a grand room, and it shows it was originally built in 1777. Cornwallis was the British leader. Gates was the American leader. Gates was north of Camden, and Gates was right here in the city. So during the Battle of Camden, which you've heard about, the Gates took his forces in the Battle of Camden, middle of the night. They met together at night with Gates and Cornwallis, and the Battle of Camden was fought early the next morning. It was one of the worst defeats in the American army, and that's why the battle was lost here. But all the Americans were defeated, but prisoners of war were brought back to this house. Some of them were killed right on this site. We think there's a mass grave maybe in front of the house. It's not been determined. That was the first battle. The second battle was the Battle of Hopkirk's Hill, which we've talked about. That was the next year in April, 1781. Forced the British out of this region. It was under Rawdon and Nathaniel Greene. But this is the leaders, and forced the British out of this region, and the Camden suffered during the war. And so the British left Camden after the second battle of Hopkirk Hill and left Camden devastated. And so this building was here and used by the British for a whole year, that we say, for a rough year. So after the war, in 1782, Joseph Kershaw did come back and lived in the house with his wife and kids for about 10 years. His brother Eli never made it back from the war. Joseph Kershaw loved this house, lived in the house about till 1800. Joseph Kershaw actually died in the year of 1791, and that was the same year that George Washington came to Camden on his southern tour and was entertained not in this house, but another house that we'll be talking about later. But that's the same year that Joseph Kershaw died, and the county was named after him, for Kershaw County, from Joseph Kershaw, because he was such a famous, well-known person of this area. So from that point, the house was lost to the Kershaws because Joseph Kershaw spent a lot of his money in trying to give to the American forces when he was prisoner of war, and never regained his money back from the government because of that. And so he lost basically the house in 1800. The house was about 1805, 1810. It was used as a school and an orphanage. It was used about several different things until about the 1820s and 1840s. By that time, the town progressively moved northward away from this site because this low-lying area is close to the swamps and disease and malaria, more desirable to move further up north. That's why this house is, by the Civil War time, it was abandoned because the town had progressively moved northward away from the site. And so the house was left abandoned about 1860, 1865, at the very end of the Civil War. Luckily, at the Civil War time, there were cameras and someone took a picture of the house, so we know exactly what the house looked like. And so that tells you the house was actually burned to the ground in 1865 because it was used as storage. And so that's the story of the house. It was used as storage, and either side wanted either side to gain access to it. So anything with storage at that time was burned to the ground. So luckily we have a photograph that notes exactly what it was. But I'm going to tell you about the house as we go along. Of course, they played cards back in those days. Cards was a famous diversion from reading and conversation, so we have the cards on the table. The pianoforte on this side. The piano's underneath, but it's closed up right at the moment. And on top of here, we have a group that shows exactly the different fortifications that were around Camden during the American Revolution. There were like 6 forts that surrounded this house called redoubts. They're like little small forts. And then when the British came, they fortified the whole city, and the whole city was fortified with a wall all the way around it. And so this sort of shows what the city was, and the road that goes right in between it. The road right out front was the old wagon trail, great wagon trail right out front. And it was the great Catawba Path also. The Catawba Path went from Virginia all the way down to Augusta. The Indians used the same trail as their trading post in Camden. A lot of people brought their goods to Camden, was shipped from Camden all the way down to Charleston, right here from Camden. So a lot of people grew crops, brought it to Camden, and was saved here. So we have the early American clock here, and we also have, in the corner here, we have a facility. This is a statue of Nathaniel Greene. This is a plaster Paris of Nathaniel Greene that was given to us. As we go along, we have the painting of the Battle of Camden, Baron de Kalb right here in the middle. And Baron de Kalb came over from Germany to fight for the American cause. He was a friend of George Washington and Lafayette, who was in the battle in the area. So George Washington came later, but they were good friends. But he was under Gates in the Battle of Camden, and unfortunately Gates was routed by the British, and he got on his horse and fled to Charlotte and further north as fast as he could go. Poor Baron de Kalb didn't know what was going on, so he was defending the field, and he was wounded 11 times before he fell off his horse, and was, unfortunately, he was wounded many times, and Cornwallis came over and noticed how famous he was, so he got his physician to attain to Baron de Kalb, and he was taken to Camden, and he survived about 3 more days and was buried across the street. On the mantelpiece, President Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was a famous president. When he was a young boy, his family lived right on the border of South Carolina and North Carolina in the Waxhaw area. And he was like a teenager, and he was anxious. He and his brother were teenagers, and they wanted to know what the British occupation was all about in the 1780s. So they decided, he and his brother, to come to Camden and find out what the occupation was about. And he got in a little bit of trouble. He was been investigating a little bit too much, and one of the British officers came over to him and asked him, young Andrew, to shine his boots, as the legend goes, and he refused to do so, being a patriot. So he and his brother were thrown in the Camden jail, which is about 3 blocks north of us, right across from the Robert Mills Courthouse. And back in the colonial days, you didn't want to be in the jails because jails were full of smallpox. You did not want to be in smallpox. So his mother came down from Waxhaw community, came down to Camden to get the 2 boys out of the jail. And unfortunately, his brother died of smallpox, and his mother did too. So that's the story of Andrew Jackson. That's why we have him on the mantelpiece. And the portrait was given to us by the Weymouth Buckley family. We have a lovely painting about 1830 that shows the house right here in the corner. It's the Kershaw Cornwallis house. So we're very fortunate to have that. It shows exactly what the house looked like on the outside. And it shows the city about that time, about 1800. And this is the dining room of the Kershaw Cornwallis house. It's a beautiful red color, and we're really excited about this house because it has all the house colonial colors in it. We researched all the colors, and this particular room has red. It's beautiful, deep red color. And if you go to colonial houses in Mount Vernon or Philadelphia, and a lot of the houses you'll see dark colors this in the room, and that was a sign of wealth because the pigments of the paints were so expensive that if you had dark walls, that was a sign of wealth. So that's why this is a beautiful deep red. So we have all the furniture was given to us by family members of the area. This beautiful dining room table has a clawfoot underneath, has a beautiful clawfoot underneath. Painting here is about 1830. Again, shows a lady riding side saddle, and that's a beautiful painting. And also this shows a little doll riding side saddle also. But it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful table. All this furniture was given to us by different people of the family area. But Joseph Kershaw entertained with his family in this room. Sarah was his wife, and she entertained. This little piece right here, we open it up, and it usually was put in front of the fireplace, and it would heat up with the fireplace and get real hot, and you could put plates. I don't think you'd put food in, but that was a good way to warm up the plates. We have the beautiful piece of furniture here that has the mirror underneath, and the reason why the mirror is underneath instead of up above is because that was to show the ladies' petticoats were showing. And back in the 18th century, you didn't want your petticoats or your ankles to be showing, so the ladies would check their petticoats in the mirror underneath, and that's why we have it here today. And some of the plates are sort of authentic from that time period. The Kershaw Cornwallis house that you're standing in today was originally built in 1777. Stood on this very site till 1865. It was burned to the ground at the end of the Civil War, and luckily we had a photograph that shows what the house looked like. The house that we're in today is 1977, rebuilt on the very same foundation of the original house. We had a grant from the Department of Interior in 1980-81, who gave us grant money for roughly $250,000 to redo this house. We were very fortunate to have that money so we could redo this house. They gave us money and expertise to actually do these front two rooms you've been in. And this is as close as we could find out what a house would look like. Like I said, the colors are original colonial colors. This beautiful doorway that they helped us put in for the colonial period. All the rest of the house for the foundation had to do ourselves. So the upstairs was not finished till just recently. So it's a huge house, basement underneath us, this floor, second floor, attic on top. Welcome to the bedroom. The bedrooms, we have two beds here. They're very famous beds that naturally would have been on the next floor, for the bedrooms. This probably would have been a parlor room originally, but we have it for the bedrooms. This is the Singleton bed that was used by Angelica Singleton Van Buren, that I'm holding a picture of her. She was from the Sumter area, and she married into the President Van Buren family. And when President Van Buren was up in Washington, D.C., this bed was actually used in the White House. And so I wanted to point out, this is the pineapple bed with her picture, and she was actually the hostess of the White House during the Van Buren administration, and it was used there. The other bed was the Boykin bed, and it was made right here in Kershaw County. It's a beautiful rendition of a bed with a bedboard that can come off and open the windows and let the air flow through. This is a bed warmer. You put hot coals in it, and you warm up the bed sheets without getting the bed too warm. You could put the hot coals with it. So that's what these are. Of course, this is a piece of furniture. It's not 18th century, but it's a beautiful piece of furniture. You can have the portrait over here is Mrs. Harrison. She's not related to the house at all, but just a very pretty lady. And she represents a little bit later time picture. We sort of represent the Civil War era of Mary Barkin Chestnut, who wrote the famous diary that we'll be talking about a little bit later. And that's what Mary Barkin Chestnut would have looked like, and that's what we're representing today. But it's just a beautiful blue room. This is the basement of the Kershaw Cornwallis house, and I want to point out that this is where Joseph Kershaw used for storage. You see the brick flooring is very important, the brick flooring that we see today. And this is where he would have used all of his storage for all his crops and all of his businesses. And he kept all of his barrels and flour and all the things that he had right on this same floor. You see the brick flooring. The reason why we have this brick flooring is because when we found the foundation in the 1960s, we found the foundation of the original house, and this shows what the bricks would have looked like. These are not all the original bricks, but we have some of the original bricks in the floor, and it shows right where the original house was, and that's where we rebuilt the house in 1977, right here on this site. Thank you.
I'm Brian Hilferty. I'm a retired Army colonel. I work at U.S. Army Central, which is at Shaw Air Force Base. We're in charge of all the troops in the Middle East and Central Asia, from Egypt to Kazakhstan and Pakistan. So that's how I got involved in this. When I was active duty there, I retired about 5 years ago. I led the staff ride. What the Army tries to do, we call staff rides. It used to be in the old days, you'd get in horses, or you'd ride across the battlefield, and the commander could judge the fitness of his subordinates, and also you'd do some team building, and primarily what we use it for is for learning. So in many ways, to the United States Army today, we don't care about the history. I like history. The United States Army doesn't care about the history for the staff ride. It's all about how does it affect us. And in our case, U.S. Army Central, which is also Patton's old Third Army, we trace our lineage and honors to Patton's Third Army. We're at, like I said, at Shaw with U.S. Air Force's Central, and so we care about the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. So for us, the way we look at this battle, or the whole Southern campaign, is from actually the view of the British. The United States Army today is the world's best, most professional, best equipped, best trained army in actually the history of the world. The British Army in 1780 was the most professional, best trained, best equipped army in the history of the world. So, and they are doing in South Carolina in the United States a lot of what we're trying to do in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, which is fight an insurgency. We call it COIN, C-O-I-N, counterinsurgency doctrine. We have a whole manual on that. And how do we fight and win an insurgency? Typically, you fight and lose an insurgency, as the British did. It's really hard. So what lesson can we learn here from the British? So again, there's not a lot of lessons from the Americans who are the rebels, right? They're the insurgents. Not trying to say anything bad about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or anything, but for our learning lessons, there is the insurgents. They're more like the Sunnis. They're more like the Taliban. They're more like ISIS for us because they're fighting against this large army, right? What we like to do is Desert Storm. So I was in Desert Storm 30 years ago now. The Iraqis put together a large army, we go crush it in 4 days. We're happy with that. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, which U.S. Army Central was in charge of, we just go through and in 2-3 weeks we're in Baghdad. We like that. It's much harder when people are all spread out, and that's the issue we're going to have here. And again, I know all of you know, some of you know a lot, some of you know a bunch about the Battle of Camden. So I'm going to try I have to talk about the battle, right? But I'm not going to try to just talk about the history because you've heard it before. So, but the overarching concept for the British is the Southern strategy. Well, I'm from Boston. I used to live a block from where Paul Revere rode his horse. I took my wife on her first date. Paul Revere drove by and he said, "The British are coming, the British are coming." It's Arlington, used to be Menotomy. More British troops were killed there on the 19th of April than any other town. They marched from Boston to Cambridge to Arlington to Lexington and then Concord. So most of the fighting though took place in my hometown. So I love all that stuff. And I didn't even know there really was a war in the South, right? I think for most of America, there's Boston, there's Saratoga, there's Yorktown, there's a bunch of stuff happening in New Jersey, and George Washington crossed the Delaware, and that's it. I had never heard of the war in the South, which was actually more casualties, more battles, more casualties here than in the North. There were no major battles in the North after 1778. So for the British, they really had 3 strategies. Starting in 1775, they had the Northern strategy. We'll just crush those Bostonian swine, and then the revolution, the rebels will stop. That didn't work. They got kicked out of Boston. They were a really bad piece of terrain. Boston at the time was a peninsula with high ground on both sides, a really bad place for the British. So then they had the mid-states strategy. We'll occupy New York, and then we'll cut up the Hudson River, and we'll cut the colonies in half, the northern colonies, the southern colonies. So Burgoyne comes from the north. Howe's supposed to go north. He decides not to, and he goes to Philadelphia instead. Burgoyne then loses at Saratoga. In many ways, a turning point of the war. Now the British don't know what to do, so they have the southern strategy. They've heard lots of rumors that there's a lot of loyalists in the South. So if they come to the South, a lot of people will rise up, and then that's a good thing for counterinsurgency. Legitimacy is the most important thing in a counterinsurgency. They'll rise up and they'll join the British. Again, that doesn't work out either. And if we look too at a bigger picture, it's a lot like United States today, right? The war in Iraq and Afghanistan is not very popular, or Syria is part of it also. in Britain, it was extremely unpopular, the war in the Americas. A lot of the British were actually pro-Americans. A lot of the British members of the House of Commons, House of Lords would have speeches against the British fighting the American. So we call today in the Army, we call it CENTCOM fatigue. So U.S. Army Central, we work for U.S. Central Command in Tampa. That's the overarching command of all of the Middle East and Central Asia, which is how the United States divides the globe. The United States Army actually today doesn't fight wars at all. The war fights all done by Central Command, European Command, African Command, Indo-Pacific Command, Southern Command. In the Pentagon, what we call CENTCOM fatigue. So we've been fighting, right, for 20 years. I was in Afghanistan in January 2002, 18 years ago. And we're still there. We call it CENTCOM fatigue in the Pentagon. The Pentagon is sick of Central Command. They're sick of giving us stuff. They're sick of sending us stuff. They started giving us money. So they don't even talk about us anymore, even though the war is still going on there. I'm kind of overstating it, but not really. They're just, the United States Army and the Pentagon make all these great things, and then they give them to us, and we break them. And we send them back, and we cost a lot of money. Same with England, right? The English aren't very happy with the war. So the British, they have a hard time getting generals. The generals don't particularly want to come here, and they have to volunteer to come serve in America. And a bigger problem the British have that we do not have is they hated each other. So Clinton, who's the general in charge at this point, is apparently disliked by everyone in his life. No one ever says anything good about him. And he and Cornwallis at this point hate each other. In fact, interestingly, after the Battle of Camden, Cornwallis sends a note back to Britain, to Lord Germain, telling him what happened. He doesn't tell Clinton, who's in New York, anything at all for like 10 days. He doesn't even bother to speak to him. So now Clinton and Cornwallis don't get along. Also, Arbuthnot is the new head of the Navy. He's like 70 years old, apparently very frail, and he also hates everybody, and everyone hates him. So he and Clinton don't get along. So the British have all these problems. They also have bigger problems that we don't have at the top. The British were broke into like these kind of commissions. There was a Bureau of Ordnance figured out what kind of weapons you got. They had nothing to do with the bureau that fed you. They had nothing to do with Lord Germain, who figured out the strategy. They're all separate. They didn't get along. It makes it really hard for the British to have a coherent strategy. But they do have the southern strategy. They come down, as you heard, they take Savannah first. At first, of course, they try to take Charleston in 1776. Tremendous victory for the rebels because they have very disorganized. They don't understand amphibious warfare is very difficult. They don't understand the connection between the ships and the land, so it's a failure. Great victory by Moultrie is the main leader. And also General Lee, who tries to stop it, who's probably the worst general in the American Army. Not related at all to Robert E. Lee or to the Lee, who's the cavalry commander here. So they go to Savannah in 1778. Then they don't have any money, and then the French enter the war, so they have to send troops. They want to come here in 1779. The French enter the war. They have to send troops to the West Indies. Also very interesting is, in the British scheme of things, the West Indies is this important, America is this important. The West Indies are more important than America. So they send troops there. They waste another year in 1780. Clinton comes down. They land near James Island. They come, they attack, put a siege on Charleston, and they have a great victory. The greatest victory of the war, personal size for them. 5,500 American troops under General Lincoln surrender in Charleston. So at this point, the British seem to have, things going pretty well. Can you help me hold this? So here is a map, kind of how, if you want to come a little closer, I'll try not to talk without my mask on too much, of how we looked at the August 4th, 1780. And what I did, this is the 1773 map of South Carolina. I put on it American military graphics. Graphics is how we describe stuff. So for instance, these lines, those are main supply routes. In Iraq, MSR Tampa is the main supply route from Kuwait into Baghdad. We always have marked MSRs and ASR, alternate supply route, so you know where to go, right? If you don't know where to go, all of a sudden you got these people in trucks getting shot up, which happened in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when a maintenance company got off the MSR. So because I'm doing what the British do, blue is good guys, right? So the British are in blue, red is bad guys in American military graphics. So we have on August 4th, this is about a month or so, a month and a half after they take Charleston. The British have Charleston, and then they've put what we call FOBs and COPs, forward operating base and combat outpost. A forward operating base is like Bagram Airfield. It's giant. We have a lot less people now. 5,000 people at Bagram Airfield. We got 4,000 people in Kandahar in Afghanistan. Then you have combat outpost at Skin, other places with maybe 500 people. So the British have FOBs, forward operating base, basically at Charleston. Then they have more like combat outposts in a circle around South Carolina, which is exactly what we do in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have COPs all across. We have COPs all across Iraq, although we're pulling them all in now. So we have in a circle, there's Charleston. We have Augusta, 96, which was huge in those days and is not even a one stoplight town nowadays. Hanging Rock, which is just north of here. I'm sorry, that was Rocky Mount, Hanging Rock, Lynch's Creek, and then Shirah Hills. And that was and then Camden. Camden's more like a FOB, a forward operating base, which is right where we're standing right now. It's really big, a couple thousand people. So that's a big deal to have that. But so you see the circle, then it goes down here to Georgetown, Beaufort, this kind of big circle. That's how they're going to protect the inland and get the people to give up. Now Gates is coming down from North Carolina, coming down this direct route, and generally we have Marion kind of screening, Army term, off to the east, and we have Sumter generally screening off to the left. And then we have General Caswell with 1,200 North Carolina militia here on Lynch's Creek. Where do I have him? But he's over here on Lynch's Creek. Okay, so we can you can hold that if you like. So that's the situation in August 4th, right? As we start to get things moving along more towards the Battle of Camden. We have again Gates coming down from the north. Lord Rawdon is here, Colonel Lord Rawdon, who's 25 years old, in charge of the troops here. Which is again the main thing. Cornwallis has come up, and Cornwallis has since gone back. Pretty much the British think they have things under control. They do one particular thing to remember that is the disaster for them for counterinsurgency is when they took Charleston, they paroled officially, they had like a proclamation, all the soldiers, and said, you don't fight against us again, you can go home. Okay, and if no one fights against you, you can just do what you want. Well, famously, John Adams said about 1/3 of the Americans were pro-British, about 1/3 were neutral, and about 1/3 were pro-rebellion. At this point, with this huge army here, there's no American fighting force in the South. When the British say that, most Americans here say, okay, I'm just not going to fight, I'm just going to be like neutral. A couple days later, though, Clinton put out another proclamation on June 3rd, and he says, I'm taking that back. You are all subject to the British, and as subject to the British, able-bodied men have to join the British Army for 6 months out of each year and fight. Now I no longer have this opportunity to just be neutral, I have got to fight against my friends. At that point, the upcountry revolts. And it's also interesting, most of the low country doesn't fight. There are very few battles in the low country after Charleston, except with Greene in like Utah Springs. There's a little, something at Monk's Corner and at Lanús Ferry. But it's mostly these upcountry people who are very persnickety and fight. I think the low country people have too much, they have too much wealth, right? It's really hard if you have a little farm and a cow. It might be easier to give up and fight the British than if you have this huge mansion and 10,000 slaves and $500,000 in the bank and 10 ships. If you fight, you lose all that. So whatever the reason, the people at the upcountry are what fight. So that's kind of the introduction and kind of how the Americans, how we look at it when we do a staff ride, right? So we're going to look at it like from the coin point of view and what can we learn. So there's other lessons, of course, in any battle. There's leadership lessons, The tactics aren't that exciting to us, honestly. When we get to the battlefield, they're going to line up 100 meters from each other and then shoot at each other and then charge with bayonets. We don't do that a lot anymore. We have bayonets, but we mostly use them to cut stuff. We don't stick them on rifles a lot and stab people. So there's not a lot of tactical lessons to be learned here, but there's a lot of leadership lessons and other things. So when Gates gets to Rugeley's Mills, about 13 miles north of here, he meets Thomas Sumter, General Sumter. General Sumter said, hey, let me block the sides of the communications for the British. If you give me 400 people, I'll go down and I'll cut the road. So right about a mile from here, right over there, is the ferry to the other side of the waterway for Camden in those days. That's the main road to the west and one of the main roads to Charleston. This road here is the exact same road it is, and the road we go up to the battlefield is exactly where it was, the Great Waxhaws Road or the Charleston Road. But that used to be the main way to get from the west. He's going to take that fort called Carey's Fort, right on the other side of the river, right by I-95 now, and take several hundred prisoners and several hundred cattle and a bunch of wagons. We'll see later, General Sumter is really a horrible general, really a terrible general in almost every way, except he's really, really tough, and he loves to fight, and he's a great political general, and he can raise forces better than anyone. But all of his battles are terrible. So he's going to lose all that stuff very soon. But so when we come here, you're going to see that Gates has sent some of his people there, down here, 400 of his force, about 10%, to do this little thing in the side. And that's another thing as we look at this big battle. There's kind of a tension always between the big army and the little army, the insurgents. That debate exists today, right? The big army is the 1st Armored Division, right? 25,000 people with 1,000 M1A2 tanks, 1,000 M2A2 Bradley fighting vehicles, artillery, Black Hawk helicopters, Apache helicopters. That's the big army. The small army is Special Forces. So Special Forces, they think they can win all the wars. The big army thinks, and I'm on the big army side, is Special Forces are awesome. They do great stuff, great bang for the buck. They don't win wars. Big armies win wars. So we're going to have, whenever you're talking about the war and the revolution in South Carolina, you're going to get both Gates' Grand Army and then Greene's army versus Marion and Sumter. Right? And Marion and Sumter never want to join up with, Sumter particularly wants nothing to do with the big army with Greene, because then he loses all of his own, his own maneuver, and he's not famous. No one knows the second in command. Like, who was the commander of the U.S. forces in Desert Storm? Schwarzkopf. Who was number 2? No one knows. Right? I was there. I don't even think I know. We all know number 1. So no one wants to. But so you've got the legend is Greene. The Swamp Fox and Sumter win the war. The reality is it's the big battles. It's going to be the Gates, the Greenes, Cowpens, Kings Mountain, Charleston that are the most important parts of the war. They're both important, right? And we have the same issues today with lines of supply, with what Sumter and Marion are going to call the line of supply. That's exactly what the insurgents do. So ISIS just blew up one of our convoys outside Baghdad 2 days ago. It was, we do contracting now, we call it white trucks, so that we had contractors carrying our stuff. They attacked it and they blew up one of the trucks. They can't attack us head on, but they can get rid of our supplies. And that's what Sumter and Marion are going to do. So now we'll head up to the battlefield. One thing is kind of interesting we talked about the battle is because it's pretty relatively flat terrain. We'll see that it's a little hilly, but relatively flat. And how they're going to do it's almost like the terrain doesn't matter that much. If you do the Normandy tour, the terrain really matters what you're doing there. If you do the Battle of the Bulge tour, it really matters the exact terrain. And that's very interesting because they haven't fixed a lot of the houses. They still have bullet holes in them from the battles. But here, it's really not too much to see because of this, but it's still very historic and important to be here. So we'll talk about the 2 armies and the 2 leaders real quick. Leadership is always important, and the principles of warfare stay basically the same. That's some of the things we can learn here. So Cornwallis is a professional soldier. He is a great soldier. He's a fighter. He's also kind of focus now. His wife, his beloved wife, died a couple years ago, and he was in America, went back. He offered to come back here, even though he didn't like Clinton. But he's a fighter, and you'll see, we're not going to really talk about it, but he does something incredible after this battle. When he's going after Greene in North Carolina, he takes all of his baggage. They had a lot of stuff then. He burns it all so he can just go light and go catch Greene and kill him. That's unheard of. He just takes all his stuff and burns it all and then goes after Greene. But Greene's even lighter and he can't catch him. They finally meet up at Guilford Courthouse and Greene loses, but he doesn't lose the war. So Cornwallis is a great general, loved by his men. He knows his men, they know him. One of the regiments going to fight here is the 33rd British Light Infantry Regiment, or Grenadiers, and that was his original regiment. So he knows them, he knows all the people. Gates, on the other hand, the army is, what happens is, as Charleston is under siege, George Washington sends a small army, 1,200 people down from the north, down from New Jersey, to come here to help. Under Baron de Kalb, who's a Prussian fighter who came over here with Lafayette. We make him a major general, and he's in charge. So he comes down, but by the time he gets to the middle of North Carolina, Charleston falls. Now there's no need for him to keep coming, so he stops. We still want him to fight the British. However, now it's a little weird to put the American forces under oppression. So we send Gates. Gates and Washington dislike each other. Gates wants to be the commander-in-chief. Gates was a British officer. Like many British officers, he fought in America. But because he wasn't rich, he couldn't get promoted. The way the British officers' ranks worked is you had to buy your commission. And so, for instance, a captain in the Grenadiers would be 5,000 pounds in those days, which is, I don't know, a couple $100,000. And a lieutenant colonel would be 10,000 pounds, right? And a colonel, if you're a colonel of a regiment, you get to get all that money. That costs you like 30,000 pounds, but then everyone has to pay you. The British did that system kind of because they wanted people involved so they wouldn't revolt against the king. But so Gates can't get promoted. So he fights in America. After the Battle of Monongahela, which is Pittsburgh, he's wounded badly there, and he's never the same. I think he has PTSD, and I think he's a coward from then on. I say coward because he had PTSD, but he's going to run away from the fight. When the war starts, America's looking for people to run our army. So we're like, well, we have these old British officers, even though there are only majors around. So one is Gates. We make him a major general. He becomes the second in command to Washington. Washington also fought in the Battle of Pittsburgh, Monongahela, and was a hero. We also have General Lee, who was the worst general in the American Army, is also a former British major. So those are the kind of guys you need someone, we use them to be generals. Gates is also the hero of Saratoga. So the Battle of Saratoga, where we beat Burgoyne in New York, Burgoyne coming down from Canada to New York City to split the colonies. At Saratoga, halfway up New York State, there's a battle and Burgoyne loses. Gates is the hero. The reality is Gates isn't the hero. Gates never leaves his tent. The hero of the Battle of Saratoga is Benedict Arnold, who, by many accounts, is the best American general we have. In every way, shape, or form, except the fact that he's a traitor, and he tries to turn over West Point. Up until then, he's a fighting general, and he's a winning general. He basically is the hero, and John Morgan of Saratoga, not Gates. But Gates gets all the glory, right? So now Lincoln is lost. We get this army. We send Gates to come down to meet that army in North Carolina, and then take the Grand Army of the South and win the war. Gates is a terrible general. He's a good administrator, but he doesn't listen to people. So he gets there. He immediately said, we're going to march down to South Carolina. Everyone says, well, you need to go by Charlotte, right? Because there's the land's better. If you go straight from where they are, by Hillsborough to Camden, the entire road is like this. It's like 200 miles or 120 miles of pine barren. It's called Pine Barren because it's barren. No food, nothing to eat. Logistics are very important, and I can't even imagine in those days, what would you do with an army? Imagine 5,000 people marching through your town and then looking for something to eat. They would eat up everything in Walmart, right? They would eat everything in Bilo. They would everything in They start going into your house. So that's what these people do. They have nothing to eat, so they're eating green corn. They're stealing anything they can, and they're starving. So he comes straight down because he doesn't listen. He also wants to meet with Major General Caswell, who was 1,200 North Carolinian militia, about 20 miles this way on Lynch's Creek. Caswell is a typical militia guy in that he never wants to join up with Gates. DeKalb says, please come join me. He doesn't. Gates says, I'm here, come join me. He refuses. He just stays where he is. And honestly, that's a problem, I think, for Osama bin Laden. You think Osama bin Laden had an easy time getting all these people together to do what he wanted them to do? They didn't. Baghdadi broke off from Osama bin Laden and helped form ISIS because they didn't like him anymore. So insurgencies always have that inherent problem that people want to fight each other. That's the problem we have in Afghanistan right now. We have the president, and we have the chief executive officer, Abdullah, who hates the president, and the old president, Hamid Karzai, hates both of them. So we have this new peace talks going on now, right? They just had a Loya Jirga, which is a meeting of the elders, and they've decided to release 400 final Taliban prisoners, and hopefully these peace talks will start. But the reason we've been there 18 years is because the Afghanis can't get along with each other. The Americans have much of the same issues. So he meets up with Caswell. Caswell is interesting because he is going to be a coward here. His troops are going to flee. But he is a hero. He's a hero of Moores Creek Bridge, which is a big victory in 1776. When the British were coming down to Charleston originally, they told all the North Carolinian loyalists, you need to rise up and meet us on the coast by Wilmington. But they say, do it, I forget when. It's like, do it, July 20th. And they do it like June 20th, which means the British aren't there. They rise up, there's no one to support them, and there's a big battle at General Caswell leads at Moores Creek Bridge. It's also a very interesting battle. He gets there first, there's a bridge, he takes up all the wood, and then he greases the remaining planks. The Scotch, or the loyalists, are very also mean. They don't care. They don't have any guns. They just have swords. So one at a time, they run across this wooden plank and get shot. And then the next guy runs across and gets shot. And then the next guy runs across and gets shot. They're pretty tough. But it's a big victory because there's never again a loyalist uprising in North Carolina after Moores Creek Bridge. Gates meets with him here and then comes to attack. Rowden at this time from Camden has taken most of his forces and moved over to a strong position on Lynch's Creek. We're going to talk about that at Saunders Creek, kind of the same thing. There's a big Lynch's Creek, basically a river, Lynch's River. It has a kind of wide swampy, South Carolina, and there's one big bridge on a built up land. That's the only way to get across. So Rowden and his troops are on this side, Caswell and Gates are on that side. It's really hard to attack across a defile like that, a single spot. So Gates takes the army in a big loop up here. Rowden collapses all his forces. He has people at Hanging Rock, at Wrigley's Mills, and they all compact back into Camden, which is the right thing to do. And Rowden's interesting. He writes later that he feels like he was cheated of a lot of the glory of the battle. He says, I was in charge of all these troops before Cornwallis got here. I could have led a battle and won, but I didn't because it wasn't the right thing to do. But then Cornwallis didn't say great things about me. So he does the right thing. He's a good leader. He does the right thing. And at that point, Cornwallis, who has good intelligence, and so does Rowden, he comes up with another couple hundred troops from Charleston. He leaves on the 10th and he gets here on the night of the 13th to take charge of the battle. That's what leaders do, right? The general, this is we call the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point. I go to where the decisive point is. If you're a platoon leader and you have 3 squads, the platoon leader goes to whatever the most important part is. Same with the company commander, he has 3 platoons, he goes to the lead platoon, not the lead platoon necessarily, the most important. So Cornwallis comes up now. At this point in the battle, Gates is up here, which is about 7 miles from here. Cornwallis is about 7 miles that way. By a very, very strange trickster fate, they both decide to leave at 10 o'clock at night and march towards the other. Cornwallis knows exactly what he's doing. He said, I'm going to attack. He knows he's outnumbered. He also knows that if he retreats, the war in the South is over, right? The American army, if we retreat from the Taliban, we have no more, the Afghanistan's over for us, right? We can't retreat from ISIS. Cornwallis cannot retreat, so he knows, and I'm going to attack it now. I'm going to do is leave at 10 o'clock. It's about 13, 14 miles. It takes me about 2 miles an hour to march. It's really hard to march all those troops and keep people going. I go 2 miles an hour. I'll get there at dawn, and I'm going to attack Rugeley's Mills. Gates realizes he doesn't have a good fighting position at Rugeley's Mills, so he says he wants to come and get on the high ground on the other side of Saunders Creek. On this side of Saunders Creek, he'll go up, occupy that, and then he'll force, he says, Cornwallis to do something, either to attack him across the same thing, a big swamp, miles long, a small defile, attack that way, or go around. And if he goes around, Gates says, I'll just go into Camden then. And meanwhile, while he's doing all this, I've got Marion over here and Sumter over here cutting all the supply lines. So that's what Gates says he wants to do. It's very strange that they both leave at 10 o'clock at night. And we have all the data. It's interesting, to the United States Army, we're big, at least I was light infantry, on light data, we call it. What is BMNT, EEN, beginning morning nautical twilight, when the light just starts to get a little light. EMNT, end morning nautical twilight, it's almost full day, sunrise, the sun's up. Moonrise, moonset, and what percent illume is really important if you're a hunter, I'm sure you know the same thing, or if you're in the infantry, because no moon and a lot of moon is a big difference. Also, the moon, surprisingly, can rise at 8 a.m. and set at 5 p.m., which means even a full moon, if it's set at 5 p.m., is the same as no moon. At that time, the moon rises at that day, because you can do it, scientists can just crunch numbers, and they can tell you the sunrise at any time. At 15,000 years ago in Siberia, they can tell you the exact time the sun rose, just by math. The sun rose, BMNT, beginning morning nautical twilight, is about 4:45 a.m. They're going to hit each other about 2:30. They have 2 hours left before it gets light. And the end evening nautical twilight, EENT, is about 10 o'clock. That's why they both are going to leave at 10 and march. But a night march is hard. So now we're going to walk down here on this battlefield trail and see where they first met. Any questions? I talk a lot.
You said something about greasing rails. What was that?
So they would fall off.
Oh, so slippery. That's it. Okay, gotcha.
He took up all the main planks and then greased the rest so they would fall off.
They would just, okay, interesting.
And those Scotch were so nasty, we're like, we don't care. We're gonna.
So was there moonlight on the night
Yes.
of the march?
Oh, so it was 100% illume. On the night of the march, we call it percent illumination, 100% illumination. Full moon, the moon rose at like 6 p.m. and set at like 5 a.m. So for the whole march, 100% illume, which is good.
So you can see your way through the trees.
Right. When there's a full moon out, you can almost read a book. So a couple of things we keep going on. What Gates does badly too, and Cornwallis does well, is Cornwallis knows his men. They know him. He's trained with them. They've been together. He has the 23rd Regiment of Foot, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the 33rd Regiment, the 71st Regiment, the Volunteers of Ireland, who are basically from Philadelphia, which is Rowden's actual regiment. They've been with him. And then he, of course, has Tarleton, who, if you've seen the movie The Patriot, the big bad guy in green on the horses, that's Tarleton. It's actually not a bad description of, except for the burning of the church and killing everyone inside, that's a pretty good description of Tarleton, who, I just said the best general on the American side was Benedict Arnold, the best fighter on the British side is Tarleton. He was just mean and fast. He goes up this road, so after the fall of Charleston, the governor escapes, Governor Rutledge, and he ends up at Rugeley's Mills, which a lot of stuff happens at. And Buford, who was a colonel with about 400 American Continentals, also escaped, and he's at Rugeley's Mills. just outside Charleston, as Cornwallis initially comes up to Camden after the Battle of Charleston, he has Tarleton with him and his British Legion, who are basically cavalry, dismounted infantry and cavalry. Often the dismounted infantry will ride with the cavalry, and they'll often fight on foot, but not always. So they're in Charleston. These guys are in Wrigley's Mills. Cornwallis tells Tarleton, I want you to go get the governor. So he goes, okay. He gets on his horse. He rides up here in like 2 days. He kills almost all his horses. He just leaves them behind, captures other horses. If there's guys, he just leaves them. He comes all the way here. The governor hears he's coming and runs away. Buford starts heading, and it's called the Battle of Waxhaw. It's right in the border of North Carolina. Tarleton catches up to Buford. First, he sends him a note saying, you need to surrender. Buford says no, so he attacks. So here's 100 British, the Royal under Tarleton, attacking 400 Americans who are on a defense, who are stopped. He destroys them all, and it's called a Great Massacre. So the American propagandists then say that Tarleton massacred all these troops. He probably did, but the Americans really play it up. So Tarleton is also in this battle. But so Cornwallis knows what he has, and he knows what he's doing. Gates has just met up with his troops, right? So not only did he just meet them, but they're militia, which basically means they're just you and me, and we said, we'll go do this. And we grab a musket, and we go with a bunch of guys. The United States Army today, we do 2-week, we call TOAs, Transfer of Authority. So right now we have 30th Armored Brigade Combat Team is in Kuwait, which is our primary force for fighting, for doing our security forces in the Middle East, and maybe fighting against Iran, but we'd never go into Iran, but we'd have security. So we have a brigade combat team there. They're being replaced by the 2nd Brigade, the 1st Infantry Division. They started doing pre-deployment site surveys a month ago. When they get there, they'll spend 2 weeks, we call a left seat, right seat ride. For 2 weeks, the leaders and the men will all be together, and for the first week, the 30th Brigade Combat Team will be in charge, and then for the second week, the 2nd Brigade, 1st Infantry will be in charge, and then they'll leave. He gets 1,000 people from Virginia the day before and says, I'm gonna now march to Camden. They don't know him, he doesn't know practice with them, they don't do anything. All this is very difficult. It's really difficult. But he says, no, we're gonna just march and head down there. A couple of other issues with that is gonna be, we call today, in the United States Army, terms we use it now is managing risk. We have risk to mission and risk to force. Often they're different and you have to manage them. So, for instance, COVID-19, we have all sorts of issues around the world. We have people in quarantine. Any soldiers we have going to the Middle East now go to quarantine for 2 weeks. And we have testing kits everywhere. So we're managing, the risk to the mission is we don't have any troops to do anything. The risk to the force is they get sick. It's the same thing if you invade the invasion of Iraq. What's the risk to the mission by going slow versus the risk to the force? Gates does none of that. Gates also does, is interesting, is you read his order for the attack. So we have, again, we use a lot of mnemonics. And one is like SMESIC, is how we do an operations order. Every operations order is exactly the same in the United States Army. Paragraph 1 is situation. Paragraph 2 is mission. Paragraph 3 is execution. Paragraph 4 is service and support. Paragraph 5 is command and signal. The reason you do that, you don't forget anything. If you just follow this, it's 3 in the morning and you haven't slept in 2 days, and you just follow the order, you've got everything. What Gates issues on his movement here is interesting. It's all he talks about is how he's going to line the troops up and what order they're going to go to. He doesn't say where they're going. He doesn't say why they're going there. He doesn't say what they're going to do when they get there. All he says is, everyone, we're going to leave at 10 o'clock at night, we're going to go in this order. That's the exact opposite of what we also call now mission-oriented orders, or Auftrags tactic. We use a lot of German words. A mission-oriented order is, I don't have to tell you what to do. I just tell you what I want. Like, I need lunch for 8 people. That's a mission-oriented order. I want you to go to Camden and go to this restaurant and then get this and that. That gets really detailed. In this case, all he has to tell the people is, we're going to march from here tonight. I'm going to go to the other side of Saunders Creek and set up a defense. So that's a task. Purpose is in order to pressure Cornwallis to make a move. That's all he had to do. No one knew what he was doing. Everyone in Cornwallis's side knew what they were doing. They were marching to attack at Rugeley's Mills. So when you read accounts of other officers in Gates's army, few of them have any idea what the purpose was. It makes it really hard and really confusing. Unlike Gates's people knew what they were doing. Plus, this is kind of humorous, they don't have a lot of food. They've been eating green corn, so their insides are bad. Typically before a battle, you give people rum in those days. Always a good idea, give people drugs. They don't have any rum, so he gives everybody half a cup of molasses.
Ooh, with the green corn in their stomach?
Molasses is a physic. So for the entire 7-mile march here, the men are breaking ranks and going into the woods and then coming back. So when they finally get this fight, they're exhausted. They all have diarrhea, they're all tired, it's the middle of the night, and then this happens. So now we're gonna just look real quick. What's gonna happen, the lead troops are gonna meet up over here. As you see where those vehicles are headed down. That's where there's gonna be a meeting engagement with the British cavalry and the American cavalry, and that starts the battle. So now we're gonna walk over here, and it's a little, onto the other side, there's another trail over here. Right now we're about here, and so I highlighted the terrain so you can kind of see the orange is terrain contour lines. So that's 300 feet, that's 350 feet. If you go down this way about a quarter mile, you go up 50 feet. That's a pretty good ride, and it drops off to the side. The green is the creeks. So you'll see that there's swamp down on low ground and swamp over here. That'll go down about 100 feet, and then further over there, low ground and swamp. So for the British, this is a pretty good fighting spot. There's ballpark 2,000 British, 4,000 Americans. It's hard to tell for sure. Some people will say less of both, but about that. If you have less people, you want to be like on this side of a V, right? So you're on both ends. There's a swamp. No one can get around your flank. If you were on this side of the V and you're a smaller fort, you could flank, you can get around the side. And that's how a lot of battles are won, is you flank them. Everyone's firing this way, you're focused this way, someone comes over here, you're like, whoa, what's going on? And you're scared and you get shot. So we can see, again, low ground here. This is kind of the ground's going up. Low ground there, low ground there, lower ground there. The forces meet at 2:30 a.m. Initially, it's the Tarleton and the British Legion in the front versus the rebels cavalry. They both shoot each other. The Americans have light infantry on both sides of the road. And again, the terrain is a lot like this. Bigger trees, you know, it's kind of like this. It wasn't all fields or anything. It was long leaf pine forest. Light infantry on the flanks shoot into the British Legion, so they break contact. The Americans, though, when all that's happened, because you could imagine, right, it's 2:30 at night, you're marching along, and all of a sudden, the horses start coming back, you're like, oh, what's going on? And so everyone's all in confusion. They get them under control, and they have to decide what to do. So both forces break contact, which is often what you would call a meeting engagement. You're not quite sure what happened. You got to figure out what's going on. Cornwallis has had a deserter had come. He actually had a spy go to Gate at Rugeley's Mill and told him what was going on. And he had, they both sides captured some people in that initial melee. So they told the prisoners, the other side, what was going on. So everyone knows now. Now Cornwallis has already wanted to fight. He wants to fight. There's a fight. It's the middle of the night. I'm good. I'm in. The terrain's good for me, and the way we look at terrain, again, the Army uses mnemonics all the time. Oak, oak. Observation. What's the observation? Okay. Avenues of approach. Is this main road? Yes. Key terrain. No real key terrain in this spot, but the high ground is better, so it's better to be higher than lower. When you're charging uphill, you know, it's harder. And when you're charging downhill, it's easier. So typically, the high ground is better. Key terrain, obstacles are the swamps on both sides, and cover and concealment doesn't really matter. and they didn't fight like that. When we would fight today, the American Army, we would get down behind a tree, right? I'd be here, there'd be another guy over there, another person over there, and we would have to have fields of fire, and we would try to cover us so they couldn't see us. They're just going to stand up. They don't really care that much about concealment. So for Cornwallis, it's good. Gates now doesn't know what's going on. Gates, again, has been, he says, planning to go another 2 miles to Saunders Creek and then stop and set up a defense. But he hasn't told anybody that. And he also knows it's the middle of the night. So he gets his generals together and they say, what should we do? So General Stevens, who's the North Carolina general, says, what else can we do but fight? And I would agree with him. The alternative is to turn around and go back that way. Now you've just got, it's hard enough doing what you're doing, but in the middle of the night telling everyone to spin around and now everyone's behind you shooting at you. And particularly in the olden days, almost all casualties were taken in retreats. What typically happened in all the battles you see in the Middle Ages, and two sides will blast away at each other or hack away at each other. The moment one side says, we lost, we're going to run away, that's when the real killing happens. Because everyone starts turning around and now people are behind you stabbing you or shooting you. So most casualties in most battles in the old days happened when one side determined they had lost. That was it. They start to run and then it's all over. Now you just chase them down and kill them. The other thing about casualties is the British were really sick. So for instance, the 71st Infantry Regiment only had maybe less than half of their people. And then some of them, like the 33rd, had been here from 1774, I think. They were all raised they were the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. They were raised in Wales. But so as you start to lose people, whether they die or they retire or they get sick, you don't fill them in, right? It's harder and harder to fill them in. So they might have got here with 600 people in Boston in 1773. By this time, they're probably down to almost half that strength. And now a lot of them are sick. Malaria, we don't realize how unhealthy South Carolina was. And the West Indies, again, a lot of troops from here would go to the West Indies to help fight off the French, and typically half of them would die of disease. So everyone has a lot less people than they had. So they decided to fight. Cornwallis is ready to fight anyway. Gates is ready to fight. So now the decisions, some of this, is what's the general's decision? In the old days, what you would line up in a line and you would put your best or most honored troops on your right. Everything went to the right. So you would put your best troops to the right. And now, so the British had the 33rd Infantry Regiment, then the 23rd Infantry Regiment, and then getting less and less, the Volunteers of Ireland, some of the North Carolina Militia, and then the 71st Infantry Regiment in reserve with Tarleton and the cavalry. Best over here. Now Gates does the same thing because he's a British officer initially. He puts on his right the Maryland and Delaware Continentals. Great troops. They've been fighting the entire war. Really great Continental troops. On the left, he puts the Virginia Militia, the North Carolina Militia. So now they're going up against the 23rd and 33rd Infantry Regiment, and his Continentals are going up against the Volunteers from Philadelphia. Gates could have done, knowing what Cornwallis was going to do, is switched it. Like, I cannot afford to have the North Carolina Militia, who just got here yesterday, up against the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. So I'm going to switch them. He also puts 100 of his Maryland brigade, which is the best fighters he has, in reserve. And he's also given 100 of them to Sumter. So Sumter is doing this raid down the river with 100 of his best troops and 300 of his militia. So that's how the battle's going to start. Again, it's kind of like this. It's just getting to be dawn, or probably before dawn. The British start to move up. Otho Williams is the adjutant general for Gates. He says, I see them, what you deploy, right, you're always in column. That's how you march. Then you have to deploy into line. And that's not that easy a thing to do. If you just told a bunch of people, they'd be like all confused. So they practice that a lot. But they see the British on this side deploying out of column. They think, well, now we can attack them. So Arthur Williams tells Gates. Gates tells the right flank to attack, hoping he'll get them. But by the time he tells them, it's all too late. They're already in line. And then he tells the left flank to attack. Now, we all know, what is the North Carolina motto? First in flight. They were second in flight. The Virginians, as soon as they see the British coming, they all throw down their weapon. The musket's like 6 feet tall, weighs like 30 pounds, it's very heavy, it's hard to run through the woods with it. They all throw down their weapons and run away. Immediately, without firing a shot. Almost all of them. The North Carolinians see the Virginians, and then you're like, well, if those guys are running, something one must be had, and this is going to go poorly. So they all throw down their weapons, almost all of them, and run away. There's a brigade of North Carolinians to the left of the Maryland and Delaware Regiment who fight. So, and there's also on that side was Armand's cavalry, about 70 guys, and Porterfield light infantry. Unfortunately, those were the guys on the flanks in the initial battle, and Porterfield was shot and killed, had a fatal wound, and Armand's cavalry was the cavalry. They were mauled. So they're in no condition to fight 2 hours later. So they're on the flank, and they immediately run away too. So this entire side is collapsed. Now, Baron de Kalb is over here, who used to be in charge, Major General from Prussia, with the great Maryland and Delaware troops. Throughout the entire Revolutionary War, whenever you hear anyone talk about the Maryland, Delaware troops, they're top notch. He's attacking and he's winning. He's doing pretty good. But there's nothing over here. Lieutenant Colonel Webster, Rowden's in charge of this wing for the British. Lieutenant Colonel Webster's in charge of this wing for the British. He's a professional soldier again. These guys run away. He knows he's not supposed to just run after them, right? Because he's got these guys over here. He does what a professional does. He wheels his troops like this. So all of a sudden, the Kalb and Maryland and Delaware and some of the North Carolinians have the 23rd and 33rd British Infantry Regiments on their flank. The General Smallwood and the reserve help come up, but the whole thing only takes an hour. It's all over, right? As soon as they're outnumbered 2-1, the British, but they're much better fighters. They're much more professional. And as soon as the North Carolina Virginians ran, the battle was over. So Webster's over here, Rowden's over here, and then Tarleton comes in with his troops. And it's all over. They just start running away. So that is the end of that part of the battle. Now they all just start running. Let's see, so that is pretty much the end of the battle. We'll go back around, we're going to follow this trail around, come back up to the part, and we'll talk about what happens after the battle. Any other questions?
You did a pretty good strategic move with that wheeling thing, but there's nothing you can do at that point. There was nothing. So.
Webster's a professional, and he did exactly that. Because if he had charged after him, maybe de Kalb was winning against the weaker troops of Cornwallis. He might have been able to do something there. There was also artillery, but not very much. Both sides had 6 cannons. Again, they're small field pieces. They shoot a cannonball. Doesn't do a lot. If it hits you, it does a lot. And they're basically on the road. So they're shooting up and down the road. But there's not, you can imagine here, cannon's not going to have a lot of impact in here.
And when you say a line, would you see a line of soldiers going through like that?
Pretty much.
Through the trees, and so it's not a clear field.
No, it's not a clear field. Now that the British were used to fighting on the I'm sure most of you have been to Europe, the fields of Europe and France and stuff are pretty open because they've been farming them for so long. So there's lots of open fields to fight on. Here it would have been just like that, so if you see, the movie The Patriot, which I like, some of the battles there, they're more like big open, and it wasn't like that. Certainly this battle wasn't. And Cowpens, which is the closing scene of the movie The Patriot, is a much smaller, compacted place. But it would have just been guys lined up. So it wouldn't have been a perfect line, because it would have been really hard to get a perfect line through all the trees.
How far was the front line? How big was it?
Probably was a good half a mile.
Half a mile.
They would have been 2 deep, typically. But if you said they had 4,000 guys, 2,000 guys, a mile's 5,000 feet, right? So that's 3 feet each. You're not shoulder to shoulder You could have been in some, but in this place you wouldn't have been. So I'd say half a mile.
This way, and then 2 miles.
When they were marching,
Yeah.
they were probably a mile and a half long in the column.
Okay,
And then they would break out. They'd probably march 3 or 4 across in column
I got you.
and then break out this way. So we mentioned the size of the armies. It's interesting to think of how big armies were in those days and today's. When the revolution started, there were only 50,000 soldiers in the entire British Army. Many of them were sick. Most were in England. There were about 5,000 in America. When this battle happened, there's 100,000 soldiers in the British Army. They've worked really hard to raise another 100,000. People don't want to join the army. It's a terrible thing. But they keep offering more and more money. The only people who join are the Scotch. The Scotch apparently are always like ready to fight. There's 100,000 in the British Army and about 40,000 in America. And in this battle, there's only 7,500 here in South Carolina. In fact, to the whole South. If you look at Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, that's about the size of Iraq. 7,500 soldiers to subdue the entire place. It's not possible. Which is one reason why Cornwallis knew he had to fight. Cornwallis, only thing he could do, he had to attack the American army, and he could defeat that, he could win. Gates does not understand, but Greene will at battles of Hobkirk's Hill. He doesn't have to win, he just has to not lose. As long as he doesn't lose, he can wait us out. The Taliban know they can wait us out. They're waiting us out right now. The Houthis in Yemen are trying to wait out the coalition against them. So Cornwallis knows what he has to do. So at the end of the battle, it's all collapsed. Everyone's running away now. Gates has run. So Gates did kind of a land speed record. In 3 days, he's in Hillsborough, 120 miles from here on horseback. He says that when the Virginians started to break, and then the North Carolinians, he went to stop them. And then they didn't, so he went a little bit further to stop, and then they didn't. He went a little bit further to stop them with Caswell, and they didn't. And then he went a little bit further, and next thing you know, I'm in North Carolina. Yeah, so I think he's a coward. Again, a coward with PTSD. He was badly wounded in Pittsburgh, so he was a fighter at one point, but he was not willing to fight. Unlike DeKalb, who was leading the Americans on the right, he dies. 3 days later, he's captured. He has 11 wounds. He's bayoneted 8 times and shot 3 times, and he's fighting at the end. Gates, meanwhile, is running. Cornwallis now sends Tarleton after the retreating people. So the baggage, another reason that Gates had said he wanted to set up a defense down the road here 2 miles, but he had sent all his heavy baggage up north towards Charlotte that night at 10 p.m. So they really hadn't gone anywhere. So they're sitting up at Rugeley's getting ready to go when these Americans go by. So you're a militia guy and you're running for your life and you go by a baggage full of officers' stuff. What do? You grab it. Right? You take all the stuff. So all the wagons of food and ammunition and stuff, the Americans first start to loot. In fact, one of Gates's aides is looking for him. He says, I admit, when I drove by, they had broken open a cask of Madeira, and I drank some of it. Then behind them comes Tarleton and his troops. So they're slashing and killing everyone they can, and they're taking all the stuff. So all the stuff, they go all the way to Hanging Rock, which used to be a combat outpost 22 miles from here, chasing the Americans. And apparently, a lot of the Americans who lived on the side of the road were doing the same thing. They were like, these guys are running by and they want water. No, go to hell. Give me that. So the Americans who live here are robbing the soldiers as they run away. So it's a complete route. Apparently it looks like, if you've seen pictures, the highway to death leading from Kuwait City into Iraq after a desert storm. So I went there, I was at the 3rd Armored Division with that right big left hook. So we were right by that highway of death. It was just a highway filled with burning vehicles for miles. Miles of burning vehicles and explosions and dead bodies and things. That's what this looked like from here all the way to Charlotte, all the way to Hanging Rock, which is 22 miles from here. So the British capture all of the stuff we had. Now, the casualties are only a couple hundred British and several hundred American, but most get away. Now, that's interesting, there are 150 Continentals captured. Cornwallis sends them, you treat Continentals, which are regular army, different than militia. You could say, and he does, some militia are traitors. He hangs people after this battle. But Continentals are regular army, they're soldiers. You treat soldiers well. He sends 150 under guard back to Charleston. They meet with Francis Marion the Swamp Fox, right where Lake Marion is now, and he captures them all back. So all those guys who are prisoner, those 150, Francis Marion captures back in 2 days. Marion is a great general. We talked about Thomas Sumter. He had gone down here with 400 guys. He had captured Carey's Fort and taken a couple hundred prisoners. He's such a terrible general. He slowly goes up the west side of now Lake Wateree, but Wateree River, Catawba River, and right about Great Falls now was called Fishing Creek. Just north of Great Falls is Fishing Creek. He takes a little siesta with his guys. Tarleton, meanwhile, has fought this battle, chased all these people to Hanging Rock, came back, and then Cornwallis says, go get Sumter. Tarleton then turns around, goes back, crosses the river, attacks Sumter and all of his men. Sumter escapes in his underwear into the bush, because he doesn't have any guards out. Sumter never has security. He never does any kind of force protection. Every battle he's in, he has no security, and he normally loses afterwards because Tarleton or someone will attack him. All the Americans run away. Many are killed and captured, and all the British prisoners, all the British wagons, and all the British cows that they had captured down here are captured back again by Tarleton. So again, Tarleton, fight the battle, go up there, kill all those people, come back, go back, kill Sumter. Sumter wanders slowly up the river. Different people. Sumter almost always is a bad general. Marion hates him, and after there's a battle down again by Lake Marion is now, a year from now, Marion refuses to have anything to do with him. Sumter does have a big victory against Tarleton in 4 or 5 months at Blackstock's farm, and Sumter is badly wounded, and it's never quite the same. That's his only really great victory. We talked about Baron de Kalb. If you go out of town, he's buried on the Presbyterian Church on Main Street. There's a big monument to him. He's a great warrior. Now what's going to happen is Greene retreats to Hillsborough. He sends a letter back to Congress saying, I don't know what happened, this is terrible. He gets relieved, and General Gates goes back to Hillsborough. General Greene is picked by George Washington to replace him, and he'll be back there in 2 months. This isn't that big a victory for the British overall. It seems like at this point they've destroyed 5,500-man army in Charleston. They've destroyed a 4,000-man army here. They've got the whole country. They write back to the king and say the South Carolina is completely subdued. But it isn't, because Marion's still out, Sumter and his guys are still out. And now, 2 months from now, many ways a turning point of the war in the South is going to be the Battle of Kings Mountain. Cornwallis takes a break here because his men are tired and there's just been the battle and he needs more forces, and then he heads towards Charlotte. His left wing is this guy, Major Patrick Ferguson, who is a great warrior. He was also the head of the recruiting militia. We would call it now a MIT team, military transition team, or we have SFAB brigades, made up of brigades without lots of small troops, just senior ranking people that train foreign forces, security force assistant brigade. Patrick Ferguson has 1,000 guys on the left flank, so he has the left flank of Cornwallis' army 2 months from now, and he's in Kings Mountain, great place to go visit, it's a state park. My kids went to camp there. There was Camp Canoga was there. He makes a mistake. He sends a note, they call the Over the Mountain Boys. The guys on the other side, past South Carolina to Tennessee, Kentucky, western North Carolina, and says, you people are in revolt. I'm going to come attack you and kill you and your family and burn down your villages. These are the Scotch-Irish people who we know are nasty. They get this message without even any kind of organization particularly. 1,000 of them just get on their horses and ride towards Kings Mountain. They have some colonels, but they generally all did it on their own. They surround the mountain, they run up the mountain, they kill him, they shoot him like 20 times, they kill the 2 women who are with him, his concubines. They kill and capture every single person, 1,000 men on top of the hill. And then they go back to Kentucky and they're never seen again. They never fight again, no one ever hears from them again. They just don't like people threatening them. That's kind of the turning point in some ways of the war, because everything had been going well, and now he's just lost 1,000 people. And then 4 months from now, Cowpens will be another big turning point, where Morgan kills, attacks, and beats Tarleton and his forces there. And now we'll go have, I think, a champagne toast to Baron de Kalb. To the great patriot Baron de Kalb, who lost his life in the Battle of Camden, to Baron de Kalb.